Most people know that the first tanks were designed with one clearly defined mission in mind: to break the stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front in 1916. They had to use metal tracks, which were themselves only a recent technological innovation, because wheeled vehicles quickly got bogged down in the endless mud which had been churned into a lunar landscape by the millions of artillery shells fired by both sides. With steel hulls impervious to machine gun fire, and machine guns or heavier weapons of their own mounted frontally or in side sponsons, the new tanks had to be able to break through barbed wire barricades and cross trenches, throwing panic into the enemy and creating breaches which the following infantry could exploit. Their success helped speed the end of World War I, but paved the way for a totally different style of conflict a mere 21 years later. One person who, as an infantry corporal in the trenches, had been impressed by the capabilities of the tank was Adolf Hitler. Once he was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, following the Nazi Party's success in that year's elections, he took advantage of the people's cries for a return to law and order by introducing a regimented police state. He also reintroduced conscription and began an enormous modernization and expansion program for the armaments industry. Many people saw this as reducing unemployment alongside the massive road and rail building programs. However, Hitler's ambitions lay outside German borders, and tanks would play a major part in furthering his schemes. The most important German medium tank at the beginning of the war was the Panzer III. This was a far cry from the ungainly machines of 2 decades earlier, with what has become an almost universal configuration. The most important feature is the turret, with full 360-degree traverse mounting the main armament, in this case a 37mm gun, which was then the German Army's standard anti-tank weapon. This in itself defined the Panzer III's intended mission, which was to destroy enemy tanks, but the 37mm gun soon proved inadequate, and it was upgraded to 50mm. Any tank design is based on a compromise between firepower, armor protection, and mobility, and as the war progressed, the need for heavier armor reduced the Panzer III's mobility. It was thus gradually supplanted by the Panzer IV, which was originally built as an infantry support tank with a short-barreled 75mm gun. As the deficiencies of the Panzer III became more and more apparent, the roles were eventually reversed, and the larger Panzer IV was fitted with progressively more powerful, high-velocity, armor-piercing weapons. From 1941 until the end of the war, it was by far the most important German tank, and could fight on equal terms with anything except some of the heavier Russian tanks. The German invasion of France and the Low Countries in the summer of 1940 introduced the world to the concept of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The Panzer divisions pioneered the use of fast-moving tanks supported by motorized infantry, which swept everything before them, while Stuka dive bombers helped clear the road ahead through terror and destruction. While the paratroops seized vital objectives in Holland, the German panzers swept where least expected through the Ardennes into Belgium and France, bypassing the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line and getting behind the French and British armies, which had moved north to meet an attack which they thought would be a replay of the World War I Schiffen plan. The Germans rapidly reached the Channel coast before swinging south to capture Paris and complete the humiliation of France. The German panzer divisions paid no heed to their flanks, bypassing pockets of resistance for the slower-moving conventional infantry divisions to mop up behind them. The French did have tanks, some of them actually superior in armor protection and firepower to anything the Germans possessed, but they did not understand how to use them. Again and again they threw them away in penny-packet counterattacks, which were quickly overwhelmed. The French actually had more tanks than the Germans, but were beaten by better training, discipline, leadership, and tactics. The Germans also understood, better at this time than anyone else, that the main tank mission is to achieve a decisive breakthrough on a narrow front. Few men understood this better than Erwin Rommel, who had commanded a panzer division in France and in 1941 was appointed to lead the Africa Corps in the Western Desert. Panzer IIIs and IVs formed the core of his 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, and to begin with, they swept everything before them. The British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa had tanks and armoured cars capable of beating the Italians, but nothing to match the German medium tanks until much later in the campaign. As in France, though, it was as much superior German handling of armour as anything, which proved decisive. Exactly the same proved the case during the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia in June 1941. The Soviet Union had been Hitler's principal target all along, and the earlier campaigns in Europe and the Mediterranean had been largely intended to secure his flanks and rear before launching the main event. Hitler saw the invasion of Russia as a European crusade against communism, and the German divisions themselves were quickly reinforced by contingents from many other European countries, including not just Italy and Spain, but also France and Belgium. Hitler believed that the campaign would be over in 4 months, an opinion shared by the United States Joint Chiefs. The campaign actually lasted 4 years, and the ferocity of the fighting has no parallel in history. It was a no-holds-barred struggle between two vastly different ideologies which killed more people than during the whole of World War I. During 1941 and through to the middle of 1943, when the heavier Panther tank entered service, the Panzer III and IV medium tanks continued to form the backbone of the Panzer divisions. These were balanced, mobile formations composed of 1 Panzer, 1 artillery, and 2 infantry regiments with supporting reconnaissance, anti-tank, engineer, and signals battalions. The infantry regiments, later designated Panzer Grenadier, were each 2 battalions strong, the first mounted in armoured half-tracks and the second in trucks, so that they could keep up with the tanks and protect them from enemy infantry. The Panzer regiments themselves were also of 2 battalions, each of 3 companies. In 1941 to 1942, 1 company was equipped with 10 Panzer IVs and 5 light Panzer IIs, while the other 2 companies each had 17 Panzer IIIs and 5 Panzer IIs. By later in 1942, the Panzer II was obsolete, and a new table of organization gave 22 Panzer IVs in 1 company and 44 Panzer IIIs divided between the other 2. The Panzer III and IV both weighed between 20 and 25 tons, depending on variant, because extra armor was bolted on at the same time as armament was upgraded during the course of the war. Both were quite spacious internally and had 5-man crews, and both were powered by 12-cylinder Maybach engines, which gave a maximum speed of around 25 miles per hour. They both carried between 80 and 90 rounds for their main gun and had a range of around 120 miles, which allowed them to stay on the battlefield for a reasonable length of time before retiring to rearm and refuel. On the battlefield itself, they were well supported by tracked as well as towed artillery and a variety of turretless assault guns and tank destroyers, in addition to 75 and 88 millimeter anti-tank guns. The German Air Force also played a significant role in supporting the Panzer divisions and, in addition to the Stuka dive bomber, deployed a variety of specialized ground attack and anti-tank fighters as the war progressed. A total of 18 Panzer divisions took part in Operation Barbarossa, and to begin with, Hitler's optimism seemed to be justified. Although the Russians had large numbers of tanks, including the heavy KV-1, which was more than a match for the Panzer IV, they were poorly commanded thanks to Stalin's pre-war purge of the Red Army's officer corps. They were also at a tactical disadvantage because only company commanders had radios, and had to communicate their orders to their other tanks using semaphore flags. Nor did the Russians at this time understand the proper use of armor, although they learned quickly. Hitler's veteran panzer crews, their morale high after the victorious campaigns in the West, ran rings around the Soviet forces, using the wide-open steppes to mount sweeping encircling maneuvers which put hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners behind barbed wire. As the first winter of the campaign approached, the stunned Russians began to rally, stopped the panzer divisions at the gates of Moscow and Leningrad, and counterattacked. The year 1942 saw much of the same, with the victorious German summer offensive, which took the panzer divisions to the Caucasus Mountains, and a Soviet counterattack which trapped the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. This signaled the beginning of the end for Hitler's dreams. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 was the largest tank battle of the war, with around 1,000 tanks deployed on each side. The result was a stalemate, but then the Red Army counterattacked in the north, relieved the siege of Leningrad, and forced the German army onto the defensive. It was the beginning of a long retreat which would end in Berlin itself. One of the main reasons for the eventual German defeat was the Soviet T-34 medium tank, which few would argue was not the best all-round tank of the whole war. Designed in great secrecy, it came as a nasty shock to the Germans because it outclassed anything they had, and captured vehicles greatly influenced the design of the Panther, which did not, however, enter service until 1943 and was mechanically unreliable. Reliability, on the other hand, was something the Soviet engineers had made a priority in designing the T-34, and this, coupled with a diesel engine, greatly contributed to the T-34's enormous success, even in several post-war conflicts. Its well-sloped armor avoided the shot traps which plagued German tanks, and its 76mm high-velocity gun was superior to anything the Germans possessed until 1943. Large road wheels and wide tracks gave the T-34 superb cross-country mobility even in soft snow, enabling it to operate when German tanks were unable to move. And because the Russians concentrated on T-34 production, whereas the Germans kept producing new or modified designs, it could be produced very quickly in quantities which rapidly negated German technical superiority. The Italians, on the other hand, never produced a really successful tank. The M1139 was based on the light CV-33 tankette and was obsolete before it even entered service in 1937. Nor was its successor, the M1340, much of an improvement. The strange thing is that both of these very inept medium tank designs had a weird but significant effect on the course of the early stages of World War II. Looking at the M1139 first, it was really only a medium tank in name and totally unsuited to the primary mission of knocking out the enemy's tanks. But it wasn't designed for that, whereas the Russians, with the T-34, had thought out both what tanks could and should be used for. Italian designers kept piling complexity upon complexity. This resulted in so-called medium tanks which were slow, not very mobile, lacked either firepower or armor protection, and were thoroughly unreliable. The M1139 looks quite impressive, but was only really suited to subjugating people armed with flintlock muskets and spears. This was fine in the new Roman Empire that Mussolini hoped to carve out for himself in the most primitive areas of East Africa. But a modern .22 caliber military rifle would knock holes in it. Its armor was scarcely over half an inch thick, no better than on a light tank or armored car, and mobility was a joke. With a top speed of 20 miles per hour on a road, infantry could move faster in rough country. The slightly improved M1340, with thicker armor and a more powerful gun, was no better. In fact, it was slower, even more top-heavy, and no more reliable because Italian designers had forgotten to build in any sand filters, so the engines kept overheating and seizing up. Even with its 47mm gun fitted in a turret, compared to the M1139's smaller 37mm weapon in a limited traverse hull mount, it quickly proved its shortcomings when it came up against British armour in North Africa in 1940. This was where the Italian armour had its effect on the war. It was so easily beaten that the British became overconfident and failed to realise the inadequacies of their own tanks until they came up against the Germans. Most Italian tanks, right up until the armistice in 1943, either ended up as burnt-out scrap metal or captured. This had nothing to do with the courage of their crews, entrusted with slow and antiquated machinery, but everything to do with Italian leadership, which was rotten to the core. Officers dined on wine and imported delicacies, while troops endured endless tin sausages, which both their German allies and British opponents simply threw away. The Italian dictator Mussolini also threw away his troops, who did not lack courage, but simply the decent officers and necessary equipment to see through to the end the tasks they were asked to fulfill. The British Army, despite the severe trouncing it gave the Italians in North and East Africa in 1940 to 1941, was no more sure about what role its tanks were supposed to play or what the most desirable characteristics were. One result of this indecision was the development of a variety of what were known as cruiser tanks intended for wide-sweeping flanking missions. They were actually rather lightweight medium tanks with reasonable range and cross-country mobility, plus a fairly good turn of speed, but little protection and, in the early war years, little firepower. Their primary mission was the same as that of any other medium tank, to knock out enemy tanks. But the little 40mm 2-pounder guns, fitted to early models, could not do that effectively, so the tanks were instead often deployed wastefully as cavalry patrol vehicles. The Covenanter was a typical cruiser design with large roll wheels and Christie-type suspension, giving a smooth ride and a speed of up to 30 miles per hour. It first appeared in 1940, but was only used as a training vehicle because engine cooling problems made it mechanically unreliable. The unnamed cruiser tanks, Marks 3 and 4, were used extensively in North Africa in 1940 and 41. They were better armoured than earlier cruiser tanks and had their 2-pounder guns mounted in the turret rather than a side sponson. Powered by a British-built version of the Liberty Aero engine, they were well suited for desert operations and had a top speed of some 30 miles per hour. They were actually the first British tanks to feature the American Christie-type suspension used so successfully on the Russian T-34. It was these tanks which Generals Wavell and O'Connor used so successfully against the Italians in 1940, alongside the Matilda infantry tank. Although classed as an infantry tank and primarily intended for the support role, the Matilda only weighed 26 tons, so is regarded as a medium tank. It only had an 8-pounder gun, which could not fire high explosive rounds, so it was not really suited for the support role anyway. Where the Matilda proved its worth in both France and later against the Afrika Korps was in its ability to absorb punishment. It had frontal armour 3 inches thick, compared with about an inch on most medium tanks. This made it invulnerable to the German 37mm tank and anti-tank guns then in service. Although the Matilda was slow, with a top speed of only 15 miles per hour, it could therefore close with the enemy to a range where even the 2-pounder gun could inflict damage. The first steps towards a true medium tank in Britain came with the Valentine, which actually entered production as early as 1940, but soldiered on during the Italian campaign until after the armistice in 1943. Like many successful tanks, it was a private venture built by Vickers without government sponsorship. Vickers were convinced that they could build a better tank than the Matilda, both more cheaply and more quickly, by using common components and factory tooling for the cruiser tanks already in production. Vickers set themselves a difficult task by stipulating a maximum weight, 10 tons lighter than the Matilda, but with similar armor protection, and only achieved this by making some sacrifices. One of these was a reduction in the number of crew members from 4 to 3, meaning the commander had to double as loader and the gunner as radio operator. Another was a reduced fuel capacity which limited range to only 70 miles, half that of the Matilda. Despite these drawbacks, the Valentine could be manufactured in 2/3 the time it took to build the Matilda, and in 1939 the War Office ordered it into production. It was a wise move because the Valentine's turret ring was sufficiently large that a 57mm 6-pounder gun could be mounted once the deficiencies of the 2-pounder became apparent. The last Valentines built, Mark 11s, even had 75mm guns. The Valentine was a dual-purpose tank which equipped not only various Royal Tank regiments in the infantry support role, but 4 armoured divisions as cruisers. Despite its cramped interior, the Valentine was very well liked by its crews because it was so solid and reliable. The 2.5-inch armour on its front and turret giving good protection, and the diesel engine reduced fire risk. Although the tank itself was obsolete by 1944, its hull and chassis were used as the basis for the Bishop self-propelled 25-pounder and the very successful Archer tank destroyer with a 17-pounder high-velocity gun. The most successful British cruiser tank of all was the Crusader, even though the first regiment to be equipped with them, part of the famous 7th Armoured or Desert Rats Division, suffered heavy losses in their first engagement during Operation Battle Axe in June 1941. Of conventional cruiser design with Christie-type road wheels and suspension, and a lozenge-shaped turret like that on the Covenanter, the Crusader had similar armour protection and armament to the early German Panzer IIIs. However, it was only slightly faster, and the 2-pounder gun could not fire high explosive. This deficiency was remedied in the definitive Mark III Crusader with 6-pounder gun, even though the 57mm round was not an effective HE shell. Nevertheless, at the end of 1941, the tank played a decisive role in the operation to break the siege of Tobruk, which was appropriately codenamed Crusader. 300 Crusader tanks also took part in the Battle of Alamein, and their 200-mile range proved invaluable in the subsequent pursuit back to the Mareth line. However, by this time the 8th Army had a better all-round medium tank in the shape of the American M3, and after the end of the North African campaign, surviving Crusaders were relegated to training duties or used as tractors for the 17-pounder gun. The last major British tank to see service in Africa was the Churchill, which, at 39 tons all-up weight, is on the borderline between a medium and heavy tank, and it was built as a replacement for the Matilda in the infantry support role. Because of the haste in designing and building them, early Churchills suffered from numerous teething troubles and had to be modified before they could be accepted for service. As a result, although design work had started in 1939, the tank did not see action until August 1942 during the ill-fated Dieppe raid, which was designed to test the feasibility of a large-scale amphibious landing on the continent. The Churchill was in all respects a better tank than the Matilda, even though it was only marginally faster. It offered its crew even better protection with armour up to 4 inches thick, while its long wheelbase with wraparound tracks allowed it to cross wide ditches and trenches, as well as to climb very steep gradients. After the Battle of Steamroller Hill in Tunisia, the German commander blamed his defeat on the Churchill's ability to scale what he called impossible heights. On top of this, the Churchill not only carried the standard 2-pounder anti-tank gun and coaxial machine gun in the turret, but also a 3-inch howitzer in the front of the hull. This gave the Churchill the ability to fire effective high explosive as well as armour-piercing rounds, which no other British tank at the time could do. This made its role more flexible, and soon 40 a week were coming off the production lines. However, Because of its low position in the hull, the 3-inch gun could not always be used effectively, and on the Churchill Mark III it was removed while the 6-pounder was installed in a new turret. This was the most numerous version, and it equipped 2 Army tank brigades in Italy as well as 4 in Normandy in 1944. In both theatres of war, the Churchill's combination of protection and firepower allowed it on several occasions to broach the enemy lines and achieve a breakthrough for lighter armour to exploit. However, the 6-pounder by this time was really obsolete, so it was fortunate that other, more modern tanks were now available in ever-increasing numbers. The first American tank to be shipped to Britain under Lend-Lease was the M3, called General Lee by the United States Army, but General Grant by the British. The first recipients were 3 armoured brigades in North Africa, 2nd, 4th and 22nd, and the new tank immediately proved its worth during the Battle of Gazala in May 1942 and the subsequent withdrawal to the Alamein Line. American observers had been impressed by the German Panzer IV during the invasion of France in 1940, and Chrysler built a new arsenal in Detroit specifically to manufacture a tank with a 75mm main gun. Because of the need for haste, the M3 was based on the existing M2 and had its gun mounted, like a World War I tank, in a side sponson. This had the drawbacks of limited elevation and traverse, and also meant the tank could not fire from hull-down positions. However, for the first time the gun was gyroscopically stabilized, so it could be fired accurately while the tank was moving. It could also fire high explosive as well as armor-piercing rounds, so the British at long last had a weapon which could tackle enemy anti-tank guns and artillery positions, as well as enemy tanks. In addition to the main armament, there was also a 37mm gun in the small turret. The M3's main drawback on the battlefield was its size, over 10 feet high, which made it an easy target. To compensate partially for this, it had frontal armor nearly 2 inches thick, while an air-cooled radial engine gave it a good turn of speed, 26 miles per hour on the flat. The M3 was not a good tank by any standards, nor was it tailored for any specific role, but it could do a bit of everything. After a succession of British tanks which could not fulfill either their primary or secondary missions properly, because the whole concept had not been thought through, the M3 was still a welcome addition to the British arsenal because it was such an all-rounder. What the Western Allies still really needed, though, was a properly thought-out medium tank with decent speed, armor protection, and a large enough gun in a fully traversing turret to match the German Panzer IV. The Allies got their tank, eventually, in the shape of the M4 Sherman, but by this time the Germans had hundreds of better armed and better armored Panthers and Tigers rolling off the production lines. The M4 Sherman was certainly one of the pieces of military hardware which helped quite decisively to win the war. That victory, though, however painful the truth may be, was not won through either technological superiority over German designs or better training, discipline, leadership or tactics. It was the vast industrial resources of the United States, already geared up to automobile production on a scale never seen anywhere else before, which won that victory in the West. The Sherman was not a patch, one for one, on the Soviet T-34, the German Panther, or even later marks of the old Panzer IV. But the United States arsenals could produce so many Shermans, just like the Russians could produce so many T-34s, that the German ground forces were ultimately worn down by sheer weight of numbers. This implies that the M4 was not a good tank, which is far from the case. Nor did Allied tank crews lack morale, discipline or leadership. The Sherman's 75mm gun was gyro-stabilized so it could fire on the move, and the 2-inch armor, coupled with a top speed of 25 miles per hour, represented a reasonable balance between firepower, protection and mobility. The first Shermans to see action at Alamein acquitted themselves well, and after the Anglo-American amphibious landings in French Northwest Africa, They were employed in ever-increasing numbers to complete the final annihilation of the Italian and German troops in Tunisia. The battle for Tunisia was not easily won, however. The terrain favored the defender, and on top of that, the Western Allies encountered the German Tiger heavy tank for the first time. Against this 55-ton monster, with its 4-inch armor and high-velocity 88mm gun, the Sherman was helpless except at close range. All Allied tank crews could do was advance at top speed, taking casualties on the way to close right in with the enemy. Unfortunately, the first major engagement for the United States 1st Armored Division was a disaster. When Rommel launched a determined counterattack through Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the division lost over 100 tanks, 2/3 of its strength, in 2 days. Rallied by Generals Patton and Bradley, however, the American tankers soon bounced back, and with Montgomery's 8th Army pressing in from the east, Rommel's forces were constricted into a steadily shrinking perimeter. The last rearguard in Tunisia finally surrendered on May the 12th. Preparations immediately began for the next stage in the Mediterranean campaign, which was a combined amphibious and airborne invasion of the island of Sicily. United States industry had not just been busy building tanks and aircraft in the 18 months since Pearl Harbor, but also ships. Amongst these were vast numbers of tank landing ships, as well as troop ships and smaller landing craft. While the troop ships anchored offshore and the infantry debarked in their landing craft, the tank landing ships had a shallow draft so that they could drive right up to the beaches. Huge doors in their bows turned into ramps down which the Shermans and other tanks and self-propelled guns could drive straight into action. Even without special preparation, the Sherman could wade ashore through 3 feet of water, and the wider tracks fitted to later versions helped them cope with soft sand. However, engineers had to lay steel wire matting for the thousands of wheeled vehicles which followed the tanks ashore. But by the time of D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, these techniques had been more or less perfected in Sicily and at Salerno and Anzio. The landings at Salerno in September 1943 were a particularly bloody affair, because the Germans were waiting for General Mark Clark's 5th Army, and Field Marshal Kesselring counterattacked in force. It took a full week to break out of the beachhead and begin the advance up the coast to Naples. By this time, Mussolini had been deposed, and the Italians sued for peace. But the campaign was far from over. Long before D-Day, the Allies were discovering both the virtues and vices of the Sherman, as the American 5th and British 8th Armies drove slowly north up the boot of Italy. As in Tunisia, the terrain favored the defender, and after the Italian surrender, the Germans constructed heavily fortified lines across the width of the country, using every piece of high ground to advantage. Shermans played a major part in all the battles of the Italian campaign. Depending on variant, the Sherman could carry up to 97 rounds for its 75mm gun, but loading these manually through the turret hatches was a tiring and sweaty job. However, the infantry valued the tank's support, particularly during the vicious street fighting in towns such as Cassino, where the defenders held the Allied advance up for so long that a second amphibious landing had to be made at Anzio to outflank the position. Numerous steep-banked rivers also slowed the Allied advance, but this had been foreseen, and special shrouds were fitted to Shermans to prevent water entering the engine exhausts. With these shrouds in place, the tanks could wade through water up to 6 feet deep, double their normal depth, and the improved horizontal suspension with wider tracks on later models made climbing the steepest banks possible, even if not always easy. The Americans and British were not alone in using the Sherman. General Leclerc's Free French 2nd Armored Division came ashore across Utah Beach on August 1, 1944, as part of Patton's Third Army. Their M4s, easily identifiable with their painted maps of France and crosses of Lorraine, the French tank crews played a major part in exploiting the breakout from Normandy and entered Paris in triumph 3 weeks later on August the 25th. They had learned the lessons from their defeat in 1940, and the 2nd Armored Division soon acquired a formidable reputation for ferociousness in combat. As the Allies roared east along the narrow French roads, they benefited from further improvements to the Sherman, including the fitting of a high-velocity 76mm gun, which could penetrate 3.5 inches of armor at 500 yards range. The best Sherman variant of all, though, was the Mark 5C Firefly developed by the British. This had an enlarged turret to accommodate the 76.2mm 17-pounder anti-tank gun, which could penetrate nearly 5 inches of armor at the same range, allowing it to tackle even the Tiger and Panther on almost equal terms. However, the basic Sherman's main drawback of thinner armor than its principal opponents, and its unfortunate tendency to burst into flames when hit, meant that even the Firefly could not take on Tigers at the same range as the German 88mm gun, so the old Western Desert tactics of closing the range rapidly were employed whenever possible. As 1944 began drawing to a close, the Allies encountered the oldest enemy of all, General Winter, and the tank crews were kept busy repainting their olive-green Shermans with whitewash to blend in with the snow. What they didn't expect, however, was a new German counteroffensive on a grand scale. On December the 16th, a barrage by nearly 2,000 artillery pieces and rocket projectors shattered the silence of the picturesque Ardennes. The Christmas card landscape, which had been regarded as the quiet front, erupted as 2 German Army and 2 SS Panzer Corps, supported by infantry and parachute divisions, ploughed into the center of the United States First Army. As the relatively weak American forces in the sector fell back and the Germans surged into the resulting bulge of the line, armored divisions principally equipped with Shermans were rapidly diverted from other operations to the north and south. The German 2nd Panzer Division actually got as far west as the River Meuse before they were stopped by the Shermans of the British 29th Armored Brigade and the American 2nd Armored Division. Bastogne, a small town commanding the junction of several important roads, now became the focus of the battle, defended almost solely by the 101st Airborne Division, until Patton's 4th Armored arrived in the nick of time on Boxing Day to lift the siege. By the middle of January 1945, the bulge had been erased. Although Hitler's grand plan of driving a wedge between the American and British forces in Belgium and Holland had failed, it did delay the Allied drive to the River Rhine by several weeks. Crossing the Rhine and advancing into the industrial heartland of Germany had to wait until March 1945, and again the Sherman tank played a major part. An amphibious version had been developed, the duplex drive, and used earlier with mixed success on D-Day, many tanks being swamped by the heavy sea. The DD Sherman had twin propellers, powered by the tank's drive train and a rubberized canvas apron to provide flotation. The apron was held up by rubber tubes inflated by compressed air and reinforced by steel struts. With the apron already in place, erecting it took only 15 minutes and the tank was ready for the water. Large numbers of duplex-drive Shermans were used during the crossing of the Rhine, even though many were lost again through being swamped or having their aprons damaged through enemy fire. The tanks could only manage 5 knots in the water, which made them sitting ducks. Nor could their crews retaliate for obvious reasons until they had reached the far bank and collapsed the canvas screens. Once across the Rhine, the Allied advance gained momentum, although the 15 German divisions trapped in the Ruhr pocket offered stubborn resistance. Every village and town was defended with fanatical determination, and the Allied tanks had to cooperate closely with the infantry and artillery in winkling out each stronghold. The Germans used every means of delaying the advance, creating improvised roadblocks with trams. Clearing these gave the versatile Sherman yet another mission. Within a month of crossing the Rhine, though, Allied armored divisions had reached Austria and Czechoslovakia, while in the east, the Russian armies fought their way street by street into Berlin. Stalin had agreed with Roosevelt and Churchill that this prize would go to the Red Army, and the Western Allies were forced to stop their advance on the River Elbe. Then Hitler committed suicide on April the 30th, and a week later the war in Europe was over. Subduing Japan would take another 3 months. The campaign in the Pacific and Burma was fought yard by yard rather than mile by mile through dense jungles and swamps. Under these conditions, tanks could not be deployed in large formations and usually operated singly or in troops rather than squadrons in close support of the infantry. The Japanese were masters of building cunningly concealed bunkers with interconnecting tunnels, and each one had to be subdued individually. The Japanese fought with fanaticism and usually preferred to die rather than surrender, which made each battle a nightmare. Then in August, the war came to a very sudden end. The atomic bombs dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki heralded the beginning of a new and terrifying form of warfare from which there is no hiding place. Although the bombs were clumsy and low yield by modern standards, they were decisive, and in the post-war era, the word deterrent took on a brand new meaning. The end of World War II saw the beginning of a new, undeclared conflict. An iron curtain descended across Eastern Europe as the West's former ally, Stalin, flexed the muscles of the Soviet Army and Air Force. The years of fear had begun, with aircraft and missiles able to carry nuclear destruction across continents. The next war, however, came from an unexpected direction. In June 1950, Communist troops from North Korea invaded the South, whose independence was guaranteed by the United Nations. Acting on a decision of the Security Council, President Truman ordered General Douglas MacArthur to lead a United Nations force to drive the North Koreans back behind the 38th parallel. An amphibious landing at Incheon, in which M4 Shermans played a vital role, took the pressure off the South Korean and Allied troops squeezed in the Busan perimeter and recaptured Seoul in September. The victory was short-lived, though. The North Koreans, reinforced by nearly 250,000 Red Chinese troops, counterattacked across the river Yalu and forced the Allies to evacuate Seoul again. MacArthur wanted to use atomic weapons and invade China itself, but Truman dismissed him and replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway. Peace did not come until after Eisenhower was elected president in 1953. It was short-lived, however, because conflict was brewing in another part of the Far East, in Vietnam. Like Korea, Vietnam had been partitioned after the Japanese surrender, and increasing incursions by the Viet Cong finally forced full-scale American intervention in 1965 to 66. The North Vietnamese forces lacked sophisticated weaponry, but what they had, the China's backing, was inexhaustible manpower to hack roads like the Ho Chi Minh Trail through the dense forests. In this type of warfare, a new weapon rapidly came into its own, the helicopter. Only deployed in tiny numbers during World War II, these machines were now highly sophisticated and could be used in a wide variety of roles. They could air-land Army or Marine Corps troops in tiny clearings, evacuate casualties, bring in supplies, and act as gunships. The latter proved one of the most vital contributions to what successes were achieved, even though the United States was under increasing political pressure to pull out. Armed with machine guns and even heavier weapons, helicopters could lay down interdicting fire while the ground forces deployed. Nor were the infantry alone in the battle, because in the 20 years since the end of World War II, a new breed of medium tank had evolved, alongside fully enclosed armored personnel carriers and self-propelled artillery. The M48 and M60 were faster and better armored than the old Sherman, had better cross-country range and mobility, and either a 90 or a 105mm gyro-stabilized gun capable of firing high-explosive or armor-piercing rounds. Since Vietnam, tank design has taken new roads, with the emphasis being based on the main battle tank derived from earlier heavy tanks. But one very successful vehicle in the medium class is the 38-ton Swedish S-tank. First entering service in 1965, but still going strong, the S-tank was, and remains, a totally unconventional design. It was, however, designed expressly for the defensive war Sweden expected she might one day be forced to fight if the Soviet Union had ever invaded Western Europe. Its primary mission is still to knock out enemy tanks, though, and because it does not have a turret and cannot fire its 105mm gun while on the move, it has often been said that it is really a tank destroyer, not a tank. However, that's how the Swedish Army, which is the only user, defines it. The S-tank's principal advantages as a defense tank destroyer are its very low silhouette and hard-hitting 105mm gun, which can fire high explosive or the latest armor-piercing, fin-stabilizing, discarding sabot rounds with very high penetration at 1,000 yards or more. The tank is designed to operate from hull-down positions with, in effect, just its gun showing. To help achieve this, it is fitted with a bulldozer blade, which not only allows it to dig itself in, but adds extra armor protection. Despite its age, the S-tank is a well-thought-out design which owes a great deal to German World War II tank destroyers like the Hetzer and Jagdpanther. Ironically, it is now being replaced in frontline service by the German Leopard 2 main battle tank. but it could still hold its own on a modern battlefield. The tank is powered by either a Rolls-Royce multi-fuel engine or a Detroit diesel for road use, plus a Boeing gas turbine which is only engaged when moving cross-country or in combat for extra performance. This gives the vehicle a road speed of almost 40 miles per hour and a range of 240 miles. The S-tank carries 50 rounds of ammunition, which are loaded automatically, while the spent cases are also ejected automatically to reduce clutter inside the vehicle. The basic design was both spacious and flexible enough to take advantage of future technological advances such as the laser rangefinder and Lyran launcher for either illuminating or smoke screen rockets, which are now fitted as standard. And in the defensive role, there is even a second driver's position to allow it to retire backwards almost as quickly as it can advance. It is also amphibious, because all models have been retrofitted with a flotation screen, very like that added to the old duplex drive Shermans. Propelled by its tracks, the S-tank can only manage about 3 knots in the water and obviously can't fire its gun while doing so. In a land like Sweden, covered by rivers, this is still an asset. The S-tank is almost certainly the end of the medium tank as it was originally envisaged. The concept was good for the 1970s, but not for the millennium. More recent weapons, particularly helicopters and other aircraft specifically designed for the anti-tank mission with very powerful missiles or laser-guided bombs, mean that a much greater deal of protection is required. The result has been the evolution of the much heavier main battle tank with much more durable armor and greater firepower. But for the best part of half a century, the medium tank concept produced the desired results.